The web is constantly changing. Users' computers are getting faster, web languages are getting more mature, and the bar of impressing a user with your website becomes higher. It comes with no surprise that the animations are so popular on the web. In today's video, we will cover the basic concepts of animating elements using the CSS transitions. We will go through all of the CSS properties available and then apply that knowledge on the project that you see on the screen right now. Transitions are the simpler way of animation. They do exactly what they say: transition your elements from one state to another. They are often used to educate the user about the purpose of the element. For example, a form input can have an active state to let the user know they're interacting with it. Or a link can have a hover transition to show that it's clickable. To better understand the concept of a transition, let's take a look at how it's used. When defining your transition, you have access to the following properties. Transition property, used to specify which CSS property will be affected by the transition. This could be something specific or can be set to affect every property. Transition duration controls how long the transition is going to last in seconds. For most of the UI elements, I wouldn't recommend going over 0.3 seconds, because that will make it look slow or laggy. Transition delay. As the name suggests, transition delay controls how long will be the delay before the transition kicks in. Transition timing function allows you to control the speed of the transition over its duration. You can either pass in the pre-made functions, like linear, is in, is out, things like that, or make your own with cubic-bezier function. The cubic-bezier function is the one that will make your website stand out. To simplify the process of creating it, there are online tools that help you visualize it and let you preview it before exporting. To make the transition work, you have to specify the property and the duration. There is also an action required that will change the state of the element. For example, a hover, focus, or some JavaScript event. You can declare one property after another, or write it as a shorthand property like this: transition, then the name of the property, duration, the timing function, and then the delay. This also lets you control several different properties like this. One thing to note is that the transitions only work with the properties with numerical values. As an example, opacity change from 0 to 1 would have a transition, since there are values between 0 and 1, like 0.1, 0.2, and so on, but a display change from block to none would not, since there is nothing in between. If you want to make a website that stands out, I suggest you try adding transitions and play with the timing of different properties. Now that we've covered the basics, let's see how it's used in practice to make this portfolio item hover effect. You might think that there's a lot going on here, but it's actually not too bad. Let's break it down. You have 4 item groups: a laptop image, the view link, the shapes on top of the laptop, and the technology images behind the laptop. All of these live inside the div with a class of portfolio item. In a normal state, the only thing you see is the laptop image. When you hover over the laptop, or rather the portfolio item div that holds it, this is what happens. The View More button fades and scales in, the 3 shapes fade, rotate, and slightly move in, and finally the technologies scale and rotate in one after another. This should make a bit more sense to you now, but if it doesn't, don't worry. We will cover this again when we make the transition. As a start, let's put the opacity of all the transition elements to 0. Now let's add the opacity back, but only on hover. Great, we got the basic transition. Now let's focus on the item groups mentioned previously, starting with the View button. In the default state, it needs to be hidden and scaled down to 80%, and when hovered, set to the initial scale of 1. The shapes are a bit tricky. First of all, there are 3 of them, and each needs to have their own transition and also the delay. Let's start with shape 1. The transform property will slightly scale the shape, move it by 50 pixels on the x-axis and negative 50 pixels on the y-axis, giving you a movement from the right and the top. There is also rotation, which for now will be set to 0, but we will animate it in a second. Time for a hover effect. The scale changes to 1, translate to 0 pixels, and the rotation is 20 degrees. Since it's a bigger element, I want to make the duration slower. Let's add the transition duration property and set it to 0.5 seconds. Shape 1 is done. To make it easier, let's copy the values from shape 1 to shape 2. We need to change the initial offset of the translate value to -25 pixels on both x and y axis, and the duration is now 0.4 seconds, since this shape is a bit smaller. Shape 2 is good to go, now shape 3. We'll copy the values again, but this time change the translate values to 10 pixels and -10 pixels. Let's also change the duration to 0.3 seconds. By now, you might have noticed that I'm writing a lot of extra CSS by copying over the values. I'm doing this to make it easier to follow each of the steps, but in a real project, I would probably combine some of these values together. This being said, if you are following me as I code, I challenge you to write these as compact as possible. At this point, I want to work on the details of our shapes. We'll do this by adding delays. Shape 1 has no delay, Shape 2 has a delay of 0.1 second, and Shape 3 has 0.2 seconds. The difference is very small, but it adds more detail to our hover effect and it kind of makes it more interesting. Now that the shapes are done, let's add the technology images. Let's do a quick breakdown. The middle JavaScript image is the one that appears first. It fades and scales up. The HTML image is slightly rotated to the left, it scales in, and moves from the center to the left. The CSS3 image is the opposite of HTML5, so it's rotated the other way around. Let's work on JavaScript first. In a default state, we'll add a transform property with scale set to 0.8 and a translate set to 0 pixels on the x and 100 pixels on y. On hover, the scale changes to 1, translate changes to 0 pixels on the x-axis and -20 pixels on y, which slightly pulls it up comparing to other two images. One thing that I've missed initially is that by accident I targeted the technology's parent div and not the actual images. So when putting the opacity to 0 and adding the transition duration to 0.2 seconds, I did that to the parent div. So whatever we're doing right now is actually not affecting the images. So we have to switch that from targeting technologies to technologies IMG. We can again copy the values for the HTML5 image. Change the translate on the initial state to 100 pixels and add the rotation of 0 degrees. On hover, let's change the scale to 1, translate to 0 pixels and 30 pixels, and rotate our element by -20 degrees. Another copy and paste for the CSS3 image, but now the initial translate value is -100 pixels and +100 pixels, making it move from the left to right on hover. And then the rotation is +20 degrees on hover. Let's work on the delays now. So JavaScript image will have a 0.3 second delay, HTML5 image will have a 0.4 second, and CSS3 image will have a 0.5 second, giving them a 1 millisecond difference between each other. The only thing that is left is to fix how these images fade out. Currently, the delay is affecting all of the states of the images, meaning that that delay that we've just added happens on both hover and when you hover away. I think it would be better to only have it on hover, so let's fix that by moving our delays from the initial state, which affects everything, to only the hover state. And there you have it. We have our hover effect ready to go. I will leave the responsiveness to you as an extra challenge. Hopefully, this gives you a better idea on what the transitions are and how effective they can be when making your website. If you liked the video, please leave a like. If you didn't, let me know in the comments why. Also, consider subscribing and checking out some of my other content. For example, I have a series where I take an existing Minecraft server and redesign it with Figma, then code it with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Thank you for watching this video until the end. I will see you in the next one.